In 1880, if you stood in a train station in Pittsburgh, there were 6 different clocks on the wall. Each one showed a different time. Each one was correct. That's because every city in America set its own time. Pittsburgh time was different from Philadelphia time, which was different from New York time. By 5 minutes here, 8 minutes there were over 300 separate time zones in the United States, and nobody thought that was strange until the railroads made it deadly. This is the story of how America lived in temporal chaos for decades, how that chaos killed people, and how a group of railroad executives, not Congress, not the president, forced the entire nation to change how they understood something as basic as the time of day. Every clock you look at today carries a compromise that was imposed on America in 1883. A compromise that cities fought against, that Congress refused to make law for 35 years, that fundamentally changed how human beings relate to the sun, the sky, and the passage of a single day. And almost nobody remembers it happened. To understand how America ended up with 300 different time zones, you have to understand something that seems obvious once you hear it, but that most people have never actually thought about. Time used to be local, not because people wanted it that way, not because of tradition or stubbornness, but because of the sun. Think about how time worked for most of human history. You wake up when it gets light. You eat lunch when the sun is highest in the sky. You go to sleep when it gets dark. The sun was your clock, the only clock that mattered. And when communities started wanting more precision than that, they built sundials, a stick in the ground that casts a shadow. When that shadow is shortest, pointing directly north, the sun is at its highest point. That moment is called solar noon. And for thousands of years, that was how you knew it was midday. Simple enough. But here's the thing about solar noon. It happens at a slightly different moment depending on where you're standing on the Earth. Because the Earth is rotating, the sun reaches its highest point over Boston a few minutes before it reaches its highest point over New York. And it reaches New York a few minutes before Philadelphia. And Philadelphia a few minutes before Pittsburgh. The difference isn't dramatic. If you're standing in a single town, everyone experiences solar noon at the same moment. Ours? But if you travel 50 miles west, solar noon happens about 4 minutes later. 100 miles west, 8 minutes later. For most of human history, this didn't matter at all, because most people never traveled 50 miles from where they were born. And even if they did, they traveled slowly, by foot, by horse, by boat. At those speeds, you'd never notice the time difference. By the time you arrived somewhere, you'd just adopt whatever local time they were using, and that was that. So every town in America set its own time based on its own solar noon. This wasn't chaos. It wasn't confusion. It was just how time worked. As natural as breathing. Boston had Boston time. New York had New York time. Philadelphia had Philadelphia time. Chicago had Chicago time. San Francisco had San Francisco time. 300 different cities. 300 different times. And within each city, that time was unified. The church bells rang at noon. The factory whistles blew at 6. Everyone agreed on when things happened because everyone was looking at the same sun. The problems only started when someone figured out how to move faster than a horse. If you're finding this interesting so far, hit subscribe. I cover forgotten American history every week. Stories like this that most people have never heard. We're just getting started on how deadly this time confusion became. Now, there's a detail here that makes the situation even more complicated. And that's the fact that most cities didn't just have one clock that everyone followed. They had multiple clocks, and they didn't always agree with each other. In the 1870s, if you walk through downtown Pittsburgh, you might pass a clock on a church steeple showing 12:05, a clock on a bank building showing 12:03, a clock at a train station showing 12:11, and another clock at a different train station showing 11:58. Were they all wrong? Not exactly. They were all measuring slightly different things. The church might be using traditional solar time, calculated from the sundial. The bank might be using mean solar time, which averaged out the slight variations in the sun's position throughout the year. and each railroad station was using the time kept by its particular railroad company. And each railroad company had made its own decision about what time to follow. This meant that the concept of asking, "What time is it?" didn't have a simple answer. The answer was, what time according to whom? For what purpose? And where exactly are you trying to be? For daily life in a single city, this was annoying but manageable. The factory whistle still blew. The church bells still rang. You could show up for dinner on time even if your pocket watch disagreed with your neighbor's pocket watch by a few minutes. But then came the railroad, and the railroad changed everything. The first railroad in America opened in 1830. By 1860, there were 30,000 miles of track crossing the country. By 1880, there were over 90,000 miles. And here's what that means for our story. A train moving at 40 miles per hour crosses about 50 miles in an hour and 15 minutes. That means the train crosses 4 minutes of time difference every 75 minutes of travel. On a long journey, say from New York to Chicago, the train would pass through dozens of different local time zones. Each town along the route had its own time, and the railroad had to figure out how to schedule arrivals and departures across all of them. The solution that most railroads came up with was simple but created its own nightmare. Each railroad company picked one time to use across its entire system, usually the time of the city where the company was headquartered. So the Pennsylvania Railroad ran on Philadelphia time. The Baltimore and Ohio ran on Baltimore time. The Michigan Central ran on Detroit time. And when you were on a Pennsylvania Railroad train passing through Pittsburgh, the conductor's watch showed Philadelphia time, not Pittsburgh time, even though Pittsburgh had its own time that everyone in Pittsburgh was using. Now imagine you're a passenger trying to catch a connecting train. You're on a Pennsylvania Railroad train that's scheduled to arrive in Pittsburgh at 2:15 Philadelphia time. You need to catch a Baltimore and Ohio train that departs Pittsburgh at 2:30 Baltimore time. But the station clock is showing Pittsburgh time. What time is it? When does your train actually arrive? When does your connection actually leave? Do you have 15 minutes to spare, or have you already missed it? This wasn't a puzzle. It was daily life for millions of Americans. Railroad stations became temples of temporal confusion. Large stations might have a dozen clocks on the wall, each one showing a different time, one for each railroad that served that station, plus local time. And travelers had to learn to read schedules that listed arrivals and departures in the railroad's time, then mentally convert to whatever time they were trying to coordinate with. In 1883, a traveler's handbook was published that listed the time standards used by various railroads. There were over 70 different railroad times in use across the country. 70 different times, just for the railroads, on top of the 300 different local times. But the inconvenience, the confusion, the missed connections, those were just annoyances. The real problem was that people were dying. On August 12, 1853, two trains collided head-on in Secaucus, New Jersey. The reason? The conductor of one train had set his watch to one railroad's time. The conductor of the other train was using a different time, and each one thought they had the right of way. 46 people died. This wasn't an isolated incident. Throughout the 1850s, 60s, and 70s, train wrecks caused by time confusion killed hundreds of people. Schedules said trains would pass each other at a certain point, but if one train's crew was working on a different time standard than the others, those calculations could be fatally wrong. In 1856, two trains collided in Camp Hill, Pennsylvania, killing 66 people. Many of them were children on a Sunday school excursion. In 1876, two trains collided in Ashtabula, Ohio. The wreck killed 92 people, making it one of the deadliest rail disasters in American history to that point. Not all of these accidents were caused by time confusion. Many were caused by poor equipment, mechanical failures, human error, but time confusion was a recurring factor. And even when it wasn't the primary cause, the chaos of multiple time standards made railroad operations fundamentally unsafe. The railroad companies knew this, and they knew they had to do something about it. If you're the kind of person who wants to understand how the systems we take for granted actually came to exist, hit that subscribe button. Because stories like this one, stories about how powerful institutions shaped American life in ways most people never think about, that's exactly what this channel covers. Now, let's talk about the man who finally proposed a solution. His name was William Frederick Allen, and in 1883, he changed how America tells time. Allen was the editor of the Official Guide of the Railways, a publication that tried to make sense of railroad schedules across the entire country. He spent his days staring at timetables, trying to reconcile the dozens of different time standards in use. Nobody understood the chaos better than he did. In 1883, Allen proposed something radical. Divide the entire United States into 4 time zones, just 4, and make every railroad, and ideally every city, adopt the time standard of their zone. He drew lines on a map: the Eastern Zone, the Central Zone, the Mountain Zone, the Pacific Zone. Each zone would be exactly 1 hour different from the zones next to it. No more 5-minute differences. No more 8-minute differences. Just clean 1-hour jumps. The time in each zone wouldn't be based on any particular city's solar noon. It would be based on the average for that entire region. This meant that for most places, the clock would no longer match the sun exactly. Noon on your clock might come a few minutes before or after solar noon in your town, but the difference would be small enough that most people wouldn't notice, and the benefits would be enormous. Allen presented his proposal to the General Time Convention, a meeting of railroad executives in April 1883. The railroads were desperate for a solution. They voted to adopt Allen's plan. And here's where things get remarkable. The railroads didn't ask Congress for permission. They didn't wait for the government to pass a law. They just decided to do it. November 18th, 1883. That was the day they chose. At noon, Eastern Time on that Sunday, every railroad in North America would switch to the new system. Think about the audacity of that decision. A group of private companies was about to change how time worked for an entire nation, not because they had the legal authority to do so, but because they controlled the railroads, and the railroads controlled transportation, and transportation controlled commerce. If you wanted to do business in America in 1883, you needed the railroads. And if you needed the railroads, you needed to use railroad time. It was that simple. November 18th, 1883 became known as the Day of Two Noons. And what happened that day was one of the strangest events in American history. At noon, Eastern Time, the Naval Observatory in Washington, D.C., sent out a telegraph signal. This signal was received by railroad stations across the country. And at that moment, clocks were reset. In cities east of the new Eastern Time Zone line, the clocks jumped backward. Noon had already happened according to local solar time, but now it was happening again according to the new standard time. 2 noons in the same day. In cities west of their zone line, the clocks jumped forward. They skipped part of the afternoon entirely. In Chicago, the clocks jumped backward by 9 minutes. At noon, local solar time, it suddenly became 11:51. Then 9 minutes later, it was noon again. In New York, the adjustment was smaller, about 4 minutes, but still there were 2 noons. People stood in the streets watching the clocks change. Newspapers described the scene with a mixture of wonder and confusion. The Chicago Tribune declared, "The railroads have undertaken to fix the time for the whole country." And that was exactly what had happened. The railroads had fixed the time for the whole country, without asking. Now you might think that Americans welcome this change. After all, the old system was chaotic, confusing, dangerous. Surely everyone could see that standardization was better? That is not what happened. Cities across America rebelled against standard time. They saw it as an imposition, an overreach, a private corporation telling them what time it was in their own town. Detroit was one of the fiercest holdouts. The city council voted to keep local time. They saw standard time as an Eastern conspiracy, a way for the railroads based in New York and Philadelphia to impose their will on the heartland. Detroit kept its clock set to local solar time, which meant that Detroit's clock showed a time about 28 minutes different from the central time that the railroads were using. For years, Detroit existed in a kind of temporal limbo. The trains ran on one time, the city ran on another. This created constant confusion. People missed trains. Businesses couldn't coordinate schedules. But the city council held firm. They refused to surrender their time to the railroads. It wasn't until 1900, 17 years after the Day of Two Noons, that Detroit finally gave in and adopted Central Standard Time. And even then, the decision was controversial. Letters poured into the newspapers complaining about the change. People felt like something had been taken from them, something fundamental. And in a way, they were right. For all of human history, time had been local. Time had been natural. Time had been connected to the sun, the sky, the rhythms of the day as people actually experienced them. And now, suddenly, time was artificial. Time was imposed from outside. Time was whatever the railroad companies said it was. This shift in how people thought about time was more profound than just moving clocks forward or backward by a few minutes. It was a philosophical change, a severing of humanity's ancient connection to the natural world. Before 1883, when you said noon, you meant the moment when the sun was highest in the sky. That's what noon had meant for thousands of years. After 1883, when you said noon, you meant 12 o'clock on a clock face that was set according to a zone boundary drawn by a railroad editor. Those two things are not the same. And some people felt that difference deeply. The poet and philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson wasn't alive to see the Day of Two Noons. He had died the year before. But his writings captured the sentiment that many Americans felt. He had written about the importance of living according to natural rhythms, of aligning human life with the patterns of the earth and the sun. Standard time was the opposite of that. It was the triumph of industrial efficiency over natural harmony. Other critics were more practical in their objections. Farmers complained that standard time made no sense for agriculture. Cows needed to be milked when cows needed to be milked, regardless of what some railroad clock said. The sun rose when it rose, and crops needed tending according to the sun, not according to a time zone boundary. Religious leaders objected on theological grounds. God had created the sun to mark the time. Who were the railroads to overrule God's design? And ordinary citizens objected on principle. This was America. Nobody told Americans what time it was, not the government, and certainly not a bunch of railroad executives in their fancy offices. The resistance was real, and it was widespread. For decades after 1883, the legal status of standard time remained uncertain. Here's something that surprises most people when they hear it. Congress did not make standard time the law of the land in 1883. Not in 1884, not in 1890, not in 1900, not in 1910. For 35 years, standard time existed in a legal gray area. The railroads used it. Most businesses used it. Most cities eventually adopted it. But there was no federal law requiring anyone to follow it. If you wanted to set your clock to local solar time and call that the real time, there was nothing legally stopping you. And some people did exactly that. Courts had to sort out disputes about what time things had actually happened. If a contract said something had to be delivered by noon, did that mean railroad noon or local noon? If a crime was committed at midnight, which midnight? Lawyers argued about these questions for years. The confusion only got resolved when America entered World War I. Suddenly, coordinating activities across the entire country became a matter of national security. Troops needed to move on precise schedules. Factories needed to coordinate production. Communications needed to be synchronized. On March 19, 1918, Congress finally passed the Standard Time Act. This law made the 4 time zones official. It also introduced daylight saving time as a wartime measure, though that's another story entirely. 35 years. That's how long it took for the government to catch up to what the railroads had done in a single day. If you've made it this far, you're clearly interested in the hidden stories behind everyday American life. Subscribe to the channel, because I cover stories like this every week. The history that nobody teaches in school, but that shaped the world you live in. Now let's talk about what this change actually meant for ordinary Americans, because the Day of Two Noons wasn't just an administrative adjustment. It was a transformation in how human beings related to time itself. Before 1883, time was something you observed. You looked at the sun, you looked at the shadows, you listened for the church bells. Time was out there in the world, waiting to be noticed. After 1883, time was something you obeyed. You looked at a clock on a wall, a clock that was synchronized with other clocks, a clock that told you what time it was, regardless of what your senses told you, regardless of where the sun was in the sky. This might seem like a small distinction, but it changed how people experienced their days. A farmer in western Indiana might wake up and see the sun high in the sky, clearly mid-morning, but his clock would tell him it was earlier than his eyes suggested. His noon dinner would come when the sun looked like it was still climbing. His evening chores would start while the day still seemed young. Over time, people adjusted. They stopped looking at the sun to tell time. They trusted the clock instead. The clock became the authority on time, and the sun became just another object in the sky. This was, in a very real sense, a kind of alienation. Humanity stepping away from a direct relationship with the natural world, intermediated now by machines, by standards, by systems. And the railroads had done it. Not for philosophical reasons, not because they had any grand vision about humanity's relationship to nature, but because they needed their trains to stop crashing into each other. The efficiency gains were real. After standard time was adopted, train collisions caused by time confusion dropped dramatically. Schedules became predictable, connections became reliable. The railroad network, which had been a patchwork of incompatible systems, suddenly functioned as a unified whole. Commerce flourished. People could plan trips with confidence. Businesses could coordinate across great distances. The telegraph, which had already shrunk the world by allowing instant communication, so now combined with standard time to create a new kind of temporal unity. For the first time, someone in San Francisco and someone in New York could agree on what time it was within an hour. This enabled new forms of organization, national corporations, coordinated financial markets, broadcasting, sports leagues with schedules that made sense. All of these things depended on standard time. But the cost was that old sense of time as something local, something natural, something connected to your particular place on the earth and your particular relationship to the sun. Let me tell you about one moment that captures this transition perfectly. In the town of Augusta, Georgia, there was a clock on the Cotton Exchange building. Before 1883, this clock showed Augusta time based on Augusta's solar noon. Yes, the cotton traders used it to coordinate their business. The townspeople used it to organize their days. On November 18, 1883, the day of two noons, the clock was reset to Eastern Standard Time. Augusta was near the western edge of the eastern zone, so the adjustment was significant. About 22 minutes. An old man was watching when they reset the clock. A newspaper reporter recorded his reaction. The old man said, "They can change that clock all they want, but the Lord's time, the sun time, that's still the true time, and no railroad can change that." He was right in a sense. The sun still followed its eternal path. Solar noon still happened when it happened, regardless of what the clock said. But he was also wrong, in a practical sense, because from that day forward, Augusta's cotton traders and Augusta's shopkeepers and Augusta's train passengers would all live by the clock, not by the sun. The Lord's time might still be the true time, but nobody was using it anymore. The Day of Two Noons was one of the largest coordinated changes in civilian life that had ever occurred in America. And it happened without any democratic process, without any vote, without any debate in Congress. The railroads simply decided, and everyone else had to adapt. This says something important about power in 19th century America. The railroads were, in many ways, more powerful than the government. They had more money. They had more employees. They had infrastructure that connected every part of the country. And they had leverage over everyone who depended on transportation. And when the railroads told America to change its clocks, America changed its clocks. The government followed decades later, making official what the railroads had already made real. Some historians see this as an example of corporate overreach. Private companies imposing their will on a nation without consent. Others see it as pragmatic problem solving. The government wasn't going to act, the railroads needed a solution, so they implemented one. Either way, it's a reminder that the systems we take for granted were often created by specific people for specific reasons in specific moments. Time zones feel natural now. They feel inevitable, like they've always existed. But they were invented by a railroad editor and imposed by a railroad cartel in one dramatic day to solve a business problem. And we've been living with that solution ever since. There's one more piece of this story that deserves attention, and that's what happened to the idea of local time after 1883. Standard time didn't eliminate local time immediately, it pushed it to the margins, into private life, into resistance. Some families kept two clocks in their homes, one showing standard time for dealing with the railroads and businesses, one showing local solar time for their own sense of what time it really was. Churches sometimes rang their bells at both times, the standard time peal for the secular world, the solar time peal for the faithful. In rural areas where the railroads mattered less, local time persisted for decades. Farmers who rarely left their counties continued to live by the sun well into the 20th century. But gradually, standardization won. Radio broadcasting, which depended on precise timing, pushed the last holdouts toward standard time. Television completed the transformation. When a show came on at 8 o'clock, it came on at 8 o'clock, and you'd better have your clock set right or you'd miss it. By the mid-20th century, local solar time had essentially disappeared from American life, except in one interesting place. The equation of time, the difference between clock time and sun time for any given location, is still printed in some almanacs and astronomical publications. Scientists still track it. But ordinary people, going about their ordinary days, never think about it. We have severed that ancient cord. The sun is no longer our clock. And that severance happened on a specific day for a specific reason or because of a specific decision made by specific men. November 18th, 1883, the day of two noons. Let me leave you with something to think about. Every time you look at a clock, you're looking at a compromise. You're looking at an agreement that was forced onto America by the railroad companies. You're looking at an abstraction, a simplification, a surrender of the natural for the efficient. That clock on your wall, on your phone, on your wrist, it doesn't tell you where the sun is. It tells you what time the railroads decided it should be. Before 1883, time was something humans discovered. We looked at the sky and saw what time it was. After 1883, time was something humans invented. We looked at our clocks and decided what time it should be. This shift from discovered time to invented time is one of the most profound changes in human consciousness, and it happened not through philosophical argument, not through democratic debate, but through the practical needs of railroad scheduling. The next time you set your alarm, think about that. Think about the 300 local times that America once had. Think about the chaos. Think about the deadly collisions. Think about the day of two noons. And think about that old man in Augusta watching them reset the clock on the Cotton Exchange. The Lord's time, the sun time, that's still the true time. And no railroad can change that. But the railroads did change something. They changed us. They changed how we think about time, how we organize our lives, how we understand our place in the rhythms of the natural world. For better or worse, we live in railroad time now. We have for 140 years, and almost nobody remembers a world where every town had its own noon. If this story made you think differently about something as simple as the time on your clock, subscribe to this channel. I cover forgotten American history every week. The stories that shaped your world, but somehow fell out of memory. The next video is on your screen now. Click it, and I'll see you there.